Hey guys, what is up? SuperKmanrocks here, and I am here for my World's Day number 4 overview and analysis. The play-in stage, well, the group stage of play-ins, I should say, ended today. We finally got the finishing touches on how these groups are going to be shaken out, moving in to the quote-unquote playoff stage, the knockout stage of play-ins here. We had all of the seeding determined. We only had 6 games on the docket today, as opposed to the usual 8 that we had in the first 3 days, but that's because there is a high probability that we're going to be getting at least 1 or 2 tiebreaker games today. So we could be ending up with a shorter day. We could be ending up with a much longer day. We really just don't know quite yet, but we're going to be going over all of the games that happened here on day 4, both the regular ones and any tiebreakers that may happen. And then at the end, I'm going to go over how I think a lot of the players and teams performed in the group stage by giving my all-pro team for the group stage of play-ins, and I'll explain that a little bit more when we get there, and then also previewing the matchups that we're going to get tomorrow, the 3-4 matchups in each group. If you guys are excited for this video, let me know down in the comment section below. I love chatting it up with you guys. You all know that. If you have different takes from me, obviously I'm going to be giving a lot of my opinions in this video. Leave yours down below, and of course, let me know what your game of the day was, what team is overperforming, what team is underperforming your expectations. There are a lot of choices, I think, for both at this tournament right now, and so it'll be very interesting to kind of get a little pulse on what a lot of people are saying right now, and so let me know down there. But without further ado, let's go ahead and jump right into our first game of the day here, and we kicked everything off here with a Group A matchup, and I'll let you know, all 3 Group A matchups come first, and then we get all 3 Group B matchups. Of course, any tiebreakers will come last, so we'll kick it off with one of the least consequential and one of the least interesting, I would say, Group A games, as we had the 2-2 Beyond Gaming taking on the 3-1 Fnatic team, and Fnatic was able to pick up the win here, and that puts them in a really, really good spot. Obviously, weren't able to take care of business yesterday against Loud. That's a pretty big disaster for Fnatic as a whole, because it puts them in a position where they're likely going to have to play a tiebreaker at the end of this game as long as Evil Geniuses take care of business, even if they are able to win, which, spoiler alert, they are able to win in this one. They looked very, very good against Beyond. We all knew they would. They were a much better team than Beyond, and they showed that throughout most of the tournament so far, but obviously that one big mistake did cost them pretty dearly. This was a good bounce-back performance, obviously. If you came in and lost to Beyond, you set up a big scenario that could have been possible. Obviously, a lot of really insane things that were technically still on the board here today for tiebreakers. You could be looking at a situation where Fnatic would end up as the 3 seed, and this loss essentially eliminates that. At worst, they can get second in this group now as long as Evil Geniuses get the job done. But what exactly happened in game number 1 here of the day? We've had quite a lot of awesome game number 1s from Fnatic in particular. Did this one live up to that? Well, not quite so much. It was a fun game, but certainly not a devastatingly fun game. I like the draft from Fnatic overall. You draft the Maokai really early and then flex it down to the support role. That's the big benefit of early picking Maokai. I think a lot of teams are really starting to understand that. There are some power picks in the meta that I think really transcend a lot of the other things we're seeing. Aatrox, Sylas, Callista, things like that really be heavily prioritized early, but Maokai absolutely deserves to be in that conversation, if only because he is an incredibly strong piece that can move to multiple spots. Is he counterable in one spot? Yes. Is he counterable in all spots? No, he's just not. And that gives him so much versatility to be able to be picked early and then move wherever you need him. And we know that everybody on Fnatic plays him. I mean, maybe with the exception of Razork. He's the only one who has yet to play Maokai at this tournament. Obviously, Wonder playing him yesterday in their loss, but Hylissang picking him up here today. Unfortunately for Fnatic, it doesn't seem like the team is ridiculously efficient and proactive on that pick quite yet, but I trust these players enough to be able to pick up Maokai eventually, and they didn't really need him in this game. Hylissang certainly made some mistakes, but man, did Humanoid go off. You gotta give him a lot of credit. He has been genuinely phenomenal throughout the entirety of the play-in so far, which has gotta be a relief to Fnatic fans. I know I have a lot of Fnatic fans in my comments section, and Humanoid just simply was not good for this team over the course of the year. He was a big reason why they ended the regular season in 5th place. I think you could make a real case that he was the biggest reason why they ended the regular season in 5th place and not as like a top 2-3 team in the region. And he has completely changed that narrative ever since he kind of found his footing towards the back half of that Excel series in the playoffs. It's been nothing but Humanoid left, and that is exactly what Fnatic really, really wants to see. Obviously, he started to draw a lot of bans on his quote-unquote signature picks that he has gotten a lot more comfortable on. Of course, the Victor, even the LeBlanc, are things that you now feel like you have to ban against him, which is a huge feather in Fnatic's cap. He just shows that he can go right onto the Akali and do a lot of the things that he's been doing. He's able to take over the game when he's on these champions that can be ridiculously proactive and more resource heavy. Obviously, Victor, LeBlanc, Akali, these are champions that you want to invest into in the mid lane. Obviously, the meta throughout the year, and especially in the playoffs, was shove and roam mids, things like the Talia, the Sylas, the Ahri even, that were really taking over a lot of the meta. I think we're definitely seeing much more of a carry-oriented mid lane come back into favor at the World Championships. A lot of that might just be due to the fact that a lot of these teams have phenomenal mid laners, but obviously these mid laners are incredibly strong right now. Akali definitely being one of them, and Humanoid gets that in this game, and he absolutely goes off. Very, very easy choice for player of the game, in my opinion. There were definitely players on Fnatic that weren't holding up their end of the bargain in this game, and I think Humanoid made the game completely out of reach no matter what anybody else was doing. A phenomenal game from him. And you also got to give a lot of credit to Wunder. He gets the counter pick on red side here, and they end up giving him the Gragas. This is a great pick into the Jax overall. I really like this as a lane matchup. Obviously, Jax can split push a lot more efficiently, and Gragas doesn't actually have the wherewithal and the kit to be able to stop that ridiculously easily, but in the 1v1, Gragas is actually in a really good spot to be able to duel Jax. Mostly because that knockup, or that body slam, really does stop a lot of what Jax wants to do. He can't really jump in on him. Obviously, Gragas isn't going to be doing a lot of damage to him, but Jax really is no threat to Gragas, and I think that opened up a lot of places for Fnatic. Wunder played this really well. Obviously, it's his best champion. He's going to be playing it at a super high level, but it's still good to see Fnatic have the wherewithal to save that counter pick for a lane that they feel like could be a huge mismatch for them in favor of themselves, and I really like that. And then Upset I thought was really good on the Aphelios. I want to see the priority on Aphelios rise. I'll talk about this later on in the video, but right now, it does seem like Kai'Sa is a little bit higher on the totem pole than Aphelios. Really not, I don't agree with that. I'm not gonna mince my words here. It's not that I don't understand that or whatever. I get where they're coming from, and I just simply don't agree. I don't think Kai'Sa is nearly the same kind of damage threat in the late game that Aphelios can be. It's just so much easier for Aphelios, especially into matchups against each other. As we saw here in game number 1, Aphelios has a significant lane advantage against a champion like Kai'Sa because he outranges her so heavily in the early game with Green Gun, and even with everything else, he's going to out-sustain, he's going to out-CC her once he gets purple. Like, there's really just not a lot that Kai'Sa can do in that lane to be able to generate a lead on her own. She's requiring a lot of assistance in order to get that, and she's going to be the same exact way into the other meta AD carries, some that are even more proactive in lane than that. And so, like the Aphelios pick, I expect him to rise in priority over Kai'Sa when people realize that he is simply just her, but better right now, in my opinion. But outside of those three, I did definitely have some questions for Fnatic. Razork and Hylissang, while they do have good stat lines here, certainly weren't dominant at any point in this game, and those are still the two players I'm the most concerned about. Razork's pathing in this game was just simply not good. A ton of opportunities that he left on the board here in terms of lane pressure that he just simply didn't want to take advantage of. That is going to be punished against better teams in the world. Beyond's not going to be able to do that, but once you get into group stage, that's going to be something that you're really going to have to pick up, and obviously Razork being such a huge catalyst for this team's playoff run, if he's not playing at a high level, this team doesn't really have a shot to take down any of the other teams in Group A at the level they need to. And then Hylissang, again, wasn't all that good here. There were multiple moments where the Maokai went in or used ultimate for absolutely nothing, no picks. He would dive way too deep, get caught out, and the other team would be forced to try and salvage the fight. Now, oftentimes, Humanoid was able to do that because of the ridiculous, and I mean the ridiculous amount of damage that this comp has with Graves, Akali, and Aphelios. There's really no one on the enemy team that's going to be able to tank that up relatively efficiently, but still, it's very concerning to see Hylissang come back and really be the regular season version of Hylissang that he was this year. Outside of Humanoid, Hylissang was also not all that good. It was a lot of Upset and Wunder really having to be the two best players on this team in the regular season for them to get into playoffs, and honestly, the last 2 days have looked significantly more like regular season Fnatic than they did like playoffs Fnatic. If they can get good version of Razork back, hopefully Hilly and Wunder can kind of get on the right track as well. Fnatic is a team that can be very scary, and obviously they put themselves in a position where if EG does miraculously drop a game later today, they're going to get out of this group, they're going to be slotted into Group A, and they're going to have an opportunity to play against some of the best teams in the world, but if they're going to go into that round and be effective, they definitely have some things they need to clean up. As for Beyond on the other side, definitely not an inspiring performance. This kind of takes everything out of their hands, although it's really hard to blame them because they're going into Fnatic. Obviously, some really good signs from Minji, who I have been very, very positive of over the course of this tournament. He has, in my opinion, been easily the best player on this Beyond Gaming team. I know a lot of people were really excited about Husha going into this tournament because he was Rookie of the Split in the PCS, and everything was looking all good for them, but just nobody else on this team really inspired me all that much. It was really a jungle mid duo here that was trying their best for Beyond to push them through to the next round, and Minji did play really well in this game. He was actually able to generate a considerable advantage, maybe not against Humanoid, but just in terms of a lot of the rest of the team for Fnatic. He was actually really strong, but unfortunately, as the Sylas, if you're the only one that's going to be going in and doing a lot of damage, it's really useless. And unfortunately, Waco, Kino, Lakai especially really weren't showing up in this game. The Sejuani pick we've seen kind of rise in priority because of the amount of utility that Sejuani obviously offers, and I do think she's a good pick, but man, it really seems like there's a ton, and I mean a ton of people playing her at this World Championships that just should not be playing her, because if you can't hit the ultimate, don't pick Sejuani, and man, there were a lot of people today that couldn't hit that ult, and Husha was definitely one of them. Waco and Kino just were never the strongest bot lane. They were always causing problems. Kino had an absolutely miserable game, and he was miserable, in my opinion, for a majority of this tournament. Definitely one of the supports that I was most concerned about. When you're on an engaged support, you're either going to look great or you're going to look awful, and unfortunately for Kino, a lot of the games that they lost were because his engages just were not good. A very bad game of Nautilus, participating to my Nautilus Pick'ems most death fund, and I really do appreciate that from him, but still, not a great game, and really contributed a lot to Beyond not winning this. And then you got to talk about Lakai in the top lane. Blind picking Jax is ridiculously bold, especially in a game where your world's life is on the line. You get counterpicked with the Gragas, but you still theoretically could do stuff. You're still going to require somebody in a side lane to be able to stop you, at least during the late mid game, I would say, where you can kind of take a lot of map pressure away from maybe a 4v5 that you wouldn't necessarily be able to win, but he was just so little of a threat that they could completely ignore him in a lot of these scenarios, and the game would just continue to go on, and that's when you know you've completely failed at Jax. A lot of people are going to give this done of the game to Kino. I'm going to give it to Lakai. You can't justify the pick. You cannot justify blind picking Jax at this tournament. There are way too many ways to deal with it, and clearly Fnatic was ready for it. And so overall, it sucks. Beyond's entire tournament life is now completely and utterly out of their hands. They need either DFM or Loud to lose, and then they potentially have an opportunity to play for that 4th place spot in a tiebreaker. Obviously, if both of them lose, they can play for that tiebreaker in a 3rd spot, but it's just, you never want to be in a position where you're just hoping that both of the other teams in your group lose so that you have a shot, especially when, you know, Loud has been playing so well recently. DFM, obviously, this is a team that made it out of groups last year. There's a lot going against this idea, and you never want to be in a position where you just have to hope and pray, but that's where Beyond have found themselves, so that's all they can hope for at this point. For Fnatic, like I said, yesterday's loss was pretty detrimental, but they've done everything they can from that point onwards. They're now 4-1 in the group. If EG wins, they're going to be tied for 1st place, and they will play a tiebreaker game to see who gets out of the group. If EG cannot pull away a win, however, Fnatic would be the only team in 1st place, so they are now hoping for DFM to be able to pick up a crucial win over Evil Geniuses later in the day. But for them, at the very least, they're going to be playing in a best of 5. Well, I shouldn't say that, because at the best, they're going to be not playing a best of 5. They're going to be straight off to group stage. But at the worst, they'll be able to play a best of 5 against one of the weaker teams, quote unquote, from the other side. And so they've definitely done all they can, but that loss yesterday is definitely coming back to bite them here. Moving on to game number 2 now, and we definitely had another interesting one here. This time, another team that we kind of talked about earlier. Every game from here on out, like, directly matters, but a team that really wants to solidify their spot in the best of 5s, and they've definitely played like they have been able to earn it against a team that wants to just show that they at least belong here at the tournament. We have the 2-2 Loud team taking on the 0-4 Chiefs Esports team, and Loud is able to pick up the win, and in 28 minutes, but I promise you, you look at the, you look at the time, you look at the kills, you look at the gold, you're like, oh, Loud must have dominated this game. For a bit, that's probably how it went, but certainly that's not how it was at the end. Obviously, Chiefs have been having a really, really tough time at Worlds so far. This is a team that came in, I think, with a lot of hype surrounding them, at least internally, because they lost only one game the entirety of Summer Split. It was game 3 of the finals, which must have felt heartbreaking, but still an unbelievable run for this Chiefs team through the LCO, and obviously that region has been a little bit scalped of talent with everybody kind of going to NA from O's, but still there's a lot of players on this team that, hardcore fans will have identified as good enough players to be playing at this World Championships, and they unfortunately just haven't been able to show up. The team honestly hasn't looked cohesive at all, and this, ironically, was their best game by far, and we'll get into that later when we're talking about Chiefs, but let's talk about Loud first. I like to talk about winners first here on this channel. Loud, I thought, played this game okay. They certainly were able to generate a really early lead off of the back of some good pathing from Croc early. I've been very complimentary of Croc over the course of this tournament. Him and Robo have definitely been the two biggest surprises from Loud, in my opinion. We knew, or at least I knew, going into this tournament that Brance and Seos were going to be an incredibly strong bot lane that we're going to be able to keep up, especially with a lot of the other minor region teams, but Robo and Croc have really extended to that level as well, and they've made them a very difficult team to actively deal with, even for the good teams in this group, and Croc did a really good job in the early game to path in a way that got Viego ahead. That can be a big problem for Viego generally, especially into a pick like Hecarim, is that being able to generate that lead relatively consistently can be a little bit more challenging than maybe just like your solo queue game with Viego or like it was a year ago. But I really got to give him credit because I do think that Croc navigated this early game very well. He was able to put himself in a position for both Robo, himself, and Tinones to be in a really good spot. Now, the one lane that ironically wasn't producing all that well in the early game was this bot lane with Brance and Seos. You kind of picked the Kalista here to dominate the lane. Obviously, Kalista, a pick that we've seen pretty heavily banned out by most teams at this tournament. I'm not exactly on that train. I definitely think Kalista is stoppable, and we kind of saw that here with the Chiefs pulling out Ashe Braum in order to kind of neutralize a lot of the early game aggression that Kalista wants to go for. It's really difficult to secure kills into this bot lane duo, and I think that really hindered Loud's early game plan at the very least, and so Croc had to improvise. He ends up getting Robo super far ahead on the Aatrox here. A very, very good early game from Robo on the Aatrox, and I've sung his praises 1,000 times at this point on this channel over the course of this tournament. I really do believe he's up there for one of the best performing top laners at the tournament, including a lot of the teams that shouldn't be in play-ins like DRX and RNG. Like, Robo has quite consistently been able to take down a lot of the threats in his group. Both Wonder and Impact lost to him 1v1 in the games that they played against him. And so, big shoutouts to Robo, and he was able to do it again in lane against Tapoon here. Tapoon does pick up the Camille as kind of that quote-unquote counter pick to Aatrox, but Camille is a counterpick to Aatrox in the sense of you are able to kind of progress the game more so than a lot of other picks where Aatrox can kind of dominate laning phase against a lot of people right now. And even a lot of tanks that want to scale into the late game with Aatrox can't handle him early, and a lot of the picks that are early game quote-unquote counters to Aatrox don't scale nearly as well into the late game where he's still going to be completely relevant. Camille kind of does a little bit of both, and that's why I think she does justify being a counter pick in this matchup, but unfortunately, Robo is just simply better, and so he's able to generate that lead anyways on the Aatrox. He does get help from Croc in the top lane, but it ends up not really mattering. He's strong enough to be able to 1v1 the Camille pretty early on in this game, and he also does a really good job, Croc, on that end, getting Tinones ahead on this Sylas. Obviously, a very common early pick now on blue side. We see this a lot from many teams because people have realized that Sylas is just pretty unconditionally the strongest mid in the meta right now, and I completely agree. He does absolutely everything that a mid laner wants to do right now. He's got carry level damage, and he can have proactivity with his engage threats, similar to that of Akali. Obviously not kind of damage levels of Akali, but proactivity levels of Akali, I would say, especially depending on the ultimates that you have available to you on the other side. But he also is really, really, really good at this shove and roam mentality that we saw a lot out of like the playoff meta, where you can just go with your jungler and try to make plays around objectives or try to funnel the bot lane or whatever you want to do in that case. He can kind of be super versatile in that regard, and that's why I think he's really risen as the #1 mid laner in the meta right now, and Tinones does a great job of being able to generate a very consistent lead on this champion. He did it again against Tally. Obviously, we've talked about Tally a bit. His laning stats are certainly not good at this tournament. He picks up the Galio for a little bit more of a consistent threat. Obviously, Camille Galio, a very good duo, but it's not going to be as proactive in lane. The melee-melee matchup typically isn't going to be super punishing, but the Sylas is a little bit different in that regard. So the top side of the map really won for Loud, and they were able to generate a very, very strong lead, but midway through this game, they just started making like small mistakes, like Tinones would get caught out in a side lane, or Robo would get caught out in a side lane, and then others would funnel in and just die, and before you knew it, this gold lead got down to like, I don't know, like 3,000-4,000 when it was at 8,000-9,000 consistently over the course of the early to mid game, and so very much not a good mid game from Loud. That's why it's very difficult for me to say they played well. They do end up pulling it back, and in the end, Robo wins a very decisive team fight to be able to push this team over the top and for them to be able to claim the win, but man, it was a rocky road. It certainly wasn't easy. Robo was the one making a lot of those mistakes in the mid game, but I'm still going to give him player of the game because he really did dominate the early game, and he dominated that last team fight in order for this team to convincingly be able to win the game from that point onwards. That's why I said, you look at it being a 28-minute game, you look at it being a 10k gold lead, and you're like, man, this was dominant, was it? Yes, like in the early game, it absolutely was, but in the mid game, not so much. Gotta give a lot of credit to Robo, even though he was making a lot of mistakes. Tinone's in that same boat, didn't end up paying for a lot of them, but certainly was facilitating a lot of weird decisions, especially on comms, if you go and listen to their comm highlights. Gotta give a lot of credit, though, to Croc and Tinone's as well, in that sense of Croc was able to facilitate a lot of that in the early game. He definitely showed up. And then Tinone's was really, really proactive on the Sylas. The gameplay mechanics of that Sylas, especially with some of the ultimates that he could steal, were absolutely phenomenal, and he played it out great. Brands and Seos honestly weren't that great in this game, but they didn't need to be. I always talk about this. Being weak side and knowing how to be weak side, even when you are typically strong side, is a huge trait that I wish other teams were able to pick up, and I think Branson Seos did a good job of that here. So, Loud, good. Chiefs, bad, but not as bad as they've been. Chiefs have kind of been run over by everybody in this group. Unfortunately for OS, they just weren't able to compete. I talked about that in the intro, but this game was kind of interesting. Like I said, they kind of got bodied in the early game. Everyone except Raisin Aladoric were getting run over. Raisin Aladoric kind of being the power, quote-unquote, points of the map. At least, or that's what I thought going into Worlds this year, but Arthur really stepped up and was probably one of the more interesting factors of why this game ended up being so difficult. The Hecarim was able to do a ton of damage and was really, really proactive in being able to catch out members that were overextended in side lanes and then kind of keep fights from going in bad directions. And him, along with Tally on that Galio ultimate, allowing you so much more macro flexibility with when and how you want to go in, I think really kept Chiefs in the game here overall. Unfortunately for them, the early game was just simply too bad and they weren't able to catch up even after a pretty good mid game, and by the end of the game, they just kind of got run over in one final team fight, and that was it. Like I said, Arthur and Tally, definitely some good points in the mid game. Raisin Aladoric did a very good job of keeping Branson Seos from dominating the early game like the Callista Amumu wants to do, and so, unfortunately, my dud of the game here is going to go to Tapoon. Like I said, Robo was phenomenal in the early game. You pick the Camille to try and stop the Aatrox, but if you get run over in lane, that Camille is going to be pretty useless no matter what ends up happening, and that's unfortunately what happened to Tapoon in this game. Obviously, a player that we know can be relatively inconsistent, was really good over the course of the year, but we've definitely seen performances from him in the past that have shown that he's not perfect, and this unfortunately was one of them. Robo was just simply the better player today, and Chiefs suffered for it, but you gotta give him at least a little bit of credit. This is better than they showed against anybody else. They must have been completely demoralized going into this game 0-4, wanting to get at least one win before Worlds ends, and unfortunately, they weren't able to do that. Hopefully, OS as a region can rebound. Obviously, a really terrible year for them on the international stage, but for all the people who want to yell at OS, we all know it's not their fault. Anybody who knows about all the circumstances and situations surrounding the LCO, lack of Riot funding, all the talent getting poached by NA, like, for them to even be here and for them to have such a dominant team regionally and even be able to get here and put up a fight against a team like Loud is honestly commendable considering the situation and the cards that they've been dealt, I think, overall as a region. And so you're certainly not going to see me piling onto the OS, like, negative train because this team has been dealt certainly a bad hand and they played it to the best of their abilities. And unfortunately, that couldn't land them a win here at Worlds. But for Loud, this is really good. This jumps them up to 3-2. And that means that there's only one more opportunity for Beyond to stay in the World Championships. If DFM does lose to EG in the next match, that means Beyond is in. Loud have at least confirmed best of fives here. There is a potential, position where they could get second in this group, but most likely they're going to be ending somewhere around 3 or 4, and you've got to be excited if you're Loud for that. This is a team that I wasn't expecting to hit the best of 5 stage, but they've outperformed my expectations at every possible scenario, and I got to give them a lot of credit because the CB LOL certainly showed up at Worlds this year, and I'm very, very happy to say that. Moving on to game number 3 now, and game number 3 is an exciting occasion for North American fans because they get to play against a minor region team for the shot to play in a tiebreaker later in order to face Fnatic, and it should be an easy road. We're gonna be able to play our way out of this group. We're gonna get first seed. Expectations are high. We're all feeling good. We lost. I can't, I'm still feeling it just a tad bit here, but we've got the 2-2 Detonation FocusMe taking on the 3-1 Evil Geniuses. Like I said, DFM's World's hopes really were staying alive with this win. EG's hopes at a #1 seed crumbling around them as they're not able to pick up the win. Fnatic fans, congratulations. This loss does officially qualify you for the group stage, as you now officially hold sole possession of the #1 seed in Group A at 4-1. So, congratulations, but for Evil Geniuses, oh boy, let's get into this game. Let's talk about DFM first, because they ended up winning it. Honestly, DFM did a really good job of the early game to try and focus on what their comp does best, which is scale, scale, scale. They've got Maokai, they've got Sivir, they've got Gnar. They're going to be incredibly difficult to deal with at 40 minutes. Hopefully this game doesn't go 40 minutes, but they're going to be really difficult to deal with once you get to that point. I've been talking a lot in more of my off-stream circles about I don't want to say this on the channel and have it come back to bite me, but expect to see more Sivir Yuumi as the worlds go along. I think people are going to realize, oh wait, I know it got nerfed, but it's still really good at what it does. It's not broken. It's not breaking the game. You must first pick it. It's the best AD carry in the meta. You have to draft something that's going to scale with it levels that it was throughout most of the year, but to pretend like it still doesn't do what it does at an extremely high level, I just think is not true. Unipon pulls out the Sivir here, Hart pulls out the Yuumi, and it felt like Summer Split all over again. We were waiting for plays. We were playing through bot lane. Steel on the Maokai was able to control a lot of the early aggression here, and even a lot of the plays that Inspired tried to make really weren't going all that well. It was really hard for this team to actually try and push the tempo, which is something that Evil Geniuses obviously really loves to do. Add on to that they draft a relatively early game focused AD carry in the Misfortune. Obviously, the ultimate is still going to be useful throughout pretty much any portion of the game, but it's not like she's going to be doing Sivir levels of damage towards the back half. You've got a LeBlanc, which probably won't scale nearly as well as the Ahri, unless you really invest into it. You've got the Sedge into Maokai. I honestly think Maokai is just a better version of Sejuani right now. And the Aatrox versus Gnar I actually think is relatively Aatrox favored, so I kind of like that, but you don't really have a lot of tools to not play slow in this. You really need to be able to generate your lead early. And Evil Geniuses really weren't consistently able to do that. DFM was keeping in pace with them throughout the entire game. You got to a point around 25 minutes where everything was relatively even until these team fights started to break out. Obviously, Dragons were an incredibly important source for both of these teams overall. They were fighting over them early, and often you eventually get to the point where they're fighting over Barons. And then you get to the late game, you get to the final team fight where you're essentially trying to bait around the Baron pit, and you think you have this phenomenal ult with Misfortune into the pit that's able to destroy a lot of people. You have Evie teleporting while in the Misfortune ult and getting absolutely obliterated trying to flank here. You're like, oh, this fight surely has to go in Evil Genius's favor. But no, a phenomenal ultimate from Evie as he comes in with the Mega Gnar. He's able to obliterate a lot of this Evil Genius's team. He played really well throughout, and there were multiple moments where there was a lot in between, which we'll get to, but this is kind of just the general recap, and DFM is able to take this game. For all the LJL fans out there, congratulations, this is absolutely huge. This sets you up, actually, in a three-way tie for second place right now, so second place is still on the docket for Detonation FocusMe if they can win out from the rest of this tournament, but let's talk about what they did well in this game. You gotta talk about the draft. I actually really do like this idea. I'm not usually a fan of super scaling comps, but you do have ways to make plays in the early game, and more importantly, you have ways to stop plays in the early game. That's the thing I'm usually most concerned about, is do you really want to go into the late game even with a major region team? But Evil Geniuses hasn't necessarily been the most, consistent late game team in the world, and especially without their quote-unquote late game carry that they've kind of been relying on throughout most of the split. In Danny on the team, I could see DFM being like, maybe if we can opt into a scenario where we have 400 CS Sivir, a Yuumi on top of her, and then Maokai in the jungle to tank everything up, a Gnar potentially for flanks, and then an Ahri to disrupt everybody on the backline. That comp is incredibly difficult to deal with, even for a team that is better than us. So I can definitely get the idea. I'm always going to be pro going to picks that are just generally strong in the meta, like Maokai, like Yuumi, which I'm scared is going to come back, but go look at my Twitter, the cat's back, baby. It really, really is, and I'm always going to be in favor of just picking power in the meta and then building around that, and I think DFM did a really good job of that. But truly the player of this game, and the one that really stood out to me, was Evie on the Gnar. Like I said, some really good plays in the top lane. Impact did have some good moments in this game. He was really keeping EG alive in a lot of these team fights, able to, tip the scales towards the back half of team fights. If they weren't able to focus Impact down, he was likely going to survive long enough to at least put a dent into DFM, and Evie, I think, was in a similar boat. His Mega Gnar timings were really, really great, but his pick potential was also fantastic. The ultimates this game were genuinely phenomenal, and honestly, people always underestimate the damage that Gnar is able to put out towards the back half of the game because people see him as just a tank, but this guy can actively hurt you if he gets on top of you, and we definitely saw that. So for me, Evie's getting player of the game just for the pure Chad. Obviously, teleporting while in Misfortunal is Giga Chad. That is one of the coolest things I've ever seen, and for it to work out is even more unbelievable. That alone earns him player of the game. Great game from him. And then you gotta give credit to Udapon and Harp. Udapon, obviously the long-standing member of this DFM team, has continued to improve over the years, in my opinion, and has gotten to the point where he is a reliable late-game carry against major region teams. Like, he can be that guy. And Harp, obviously, on the Yuumi, he looked okay on it in this game. We didn't really see a lot of that from him throughout the regular season in the LJL. I talked about that in my preview. But the Sivir Yuumi definitely looked good in this matchup here. Vulcan opting into the Soraka to try to negate a lot of what Yuumi did, but he didn't build Putrefier, and I still don't know why, so it ended up not really mattering all that much, and Udapon and Harp were able to do a ton in the back half of the game. Credit to Steel, credit to Yaharong. DFM did their part in this game. I give credit to Evie, but Udapon and Harp definitely deserve a lot of it too. For Evil Geniuses, okay, so now you can no longer get first place in the group. You're at least going to have to play one best of 5, but that's fine, because there are people you can beat on the other side. But now you're in a 3-way tie for second place, which means, and especially with the tiebreaker rules, it depends on time of victory against the other teams, and that means you're not even slotted into the final game here. You have to win 2 more games later today in order to secure that second seed, and you're thinking, oh well, we'll just get third seed and win that game, and win that series against DFM or whatever, and then move on to play the 2 seed. But the 2 seed might be RNG in the other group, and you're not winning that. You're just not. That is the Exodia of play-ins right now. So you have now put yourself in a position where you are really struggling, and it's all because this game just had a bunch of minor mistakes. I actually think Inspired and Impact played relatively well in this one. Impact, especially towards the mid-game of those team fights, was really keeping EG in a lot of it. Without his presence on the Aatrox, they would have lost a ton sooner, and I thought Inspired's macro was actually pretty solid. If he could hit an ultimate, that would help a lot. But Jojo and Vulcan really didn't show up here. It's hard for me to blame Jojo, because he's on a low-damage assassin, at least in this case. It's not a low-damage champion, but a low-damage assassin. And he's forced to build anti-heal on that champion because Vulcan, for some reason, just refuses to buy Putrefier. So Jojo has to compromise pretty much all of his damage in the mid-game to try and get any level of anti-heal on here. Vulcan, meanwhile, is doing absolutely nothing in the bottom lane on this Soraka. The pick just didn't help at all. And some of the extended trades, I could see the value of it, but compared to the Yuumi, it didn't work at all. It didn't work in any circumstance, and so that was frustrating. And then there was Kaori and the AD carry role, and I'm not going to blame him too hard, but these Misfortune ultimates were not it. You have to be on the money with this, and it's definitely more difficult when you don't have that engager, that lockdown CC on the team to be able to set you up for those ultimates, but they have to hit, and he did almost no damage in this game overall, especially towards the back half, and I was very disappointed. So he's going to get my dud of the game. It could very well go to Vulcan just for the atrocious mental that he had in this game. I can't stress enough how not building Putrefier was awful on this Soraka, and it definitely came back to bite EG. So, like I said, that's where it leaves them. They're both at the same record now. They're both at 3-2. They're going to be in a 3-way tie for second place right now with Loud. We'll get into the tiebreaker rules, I guess now, because we'll get into the tiebreakers later, obviously. But it's game time against the team that you beat out of the 3. All of them beat each other once. And so the number 2 seed, the one that gets a bye in the first round of this hypothetical, is Loud. And so it's going to be DFM and EG facing off again later today, with the winner playing against Loud for that number 2 seed. An absolutely huge matchup. EG now has to win 2 more games to even secure their spot in the number 2 seed. Anything else is a disaster for any team that gets it. And so you got to really hope that they're able to win out. But for DFM, this kept your tournament life alive. If you're able to somehow claw out the number 2 seed later by beating EG again and then beating Loud later, you're now in a much better spot. Instead of potentially having to face a team like RNG in a best of 5, you could face a team like Mad Lions, who, well, yes, they still are good, are beatable. They're not untouchable, and that's awesome for DFM. Overall, really got to be happy with them showing the resilience and being able to come out here with the win with basically their tournament lives on the line. This has officially knocked Beyond Gaming out of the tournament. Definitely sad for them, but honestly, they didn't quite play up to the standard of being able to make the best of 5s anyway, so I'm glad to see the 4 teams from Group A make it, that do make it. But that's the end of Group 1. We've got everything locked in. It's time to move on to Group B. Moving on to game number 4 now. We had a battle of the win list. Certainly something to be a little bit more of a buffer in between some of these crazy games that we've had throughout the day. Two teams that have absolutely no bearing on the best of fives, as both of them have mathematically already been eliminated, but one of them will end this tournament 0-5 along with Chiefs. We had the 0-4 Istanbul Wildcats taking on the 0-4 Isurus gaming team, and Isurus is pretty shockingly able to pull out a big win for the team here in front of their home crowd, in front of a lot of their parents. I know Grell's parents were here, and that must have been awesome. Obviously, it's not very often you get to have Worlds in your own country. For you to be able to at least win one game in front of your home crowd, I think has to feel pretty good for Isurus, but not so good for the Wildcats, who definitely did not come to this tournament expecting to go 0-5. Obviously, they drew a ridiculously difficult group, and there really was never a shot of them being able to even play a best of 5. The top 4 in this group definitely felt a little separated, in my opinion, but they still didn't really show up in a lot of those games, and their players definitely didn't play like they were supposed to. And this loss to Isurus is pretty unacceptable. You can only really describe it with mental, or with just the fact that maybe they were overrated all along. But let's talk about Isurus first. This is a team I've really enjoyed watching at the tournament so far. Obviously, some insane picks from this team. Nobody is going to forget the Teemo Saigon mid draft. And absolutely a one for the record books, if you will. Really, really fun to watch. But they come back with something a little bit more standard to close out their Worlds run here. They themselves have been searching for that Aatrox counter pick. They tried Zillion. They tried Teemo. They bite the bullet and actually just pick Aatrox this time. And what do you know? ADD has a really good game on the Aatrox, and maybe you should have just been picking it all along. I know obviously B1 is a very common spot for that Aatrox pick, but if you can't beat it, maybe just ban it? Who knows? Anyways, ADD looks really good on this Aatrox pick, but this game and this entire tournament for Isurus has been the Grell show. And it's really fun to see. Honestly, Grell is one of those junglers that plays with that chip on his shoulder. Very much reminds me of Jose Deodo from a couple of years ago at Worlds. Just somebody who comes into the tournament looking to make a name for themselves. And I really do think that Grell did that at this tournament. He was really good in game number 1 against Mad Lions, which I don't think anybody saw coming. Elyoya has been awesome. And honestly, he's continued that throughout the rest of the tournament. Even though Isurus has really struggled to be able to pick up a consistent amount of wins and be able to generate a consistent amount of leads in the early game, it's really not Grell's fault. He's been a phenomenal carry threat, and honestly, ever since that game 1 has been perma-targeted in draft. You can even see it here. Graves, Hecarim, Trundle, pretty much anything he can be very active on was taken away from him. Obviously, that Graves pick was what he did numbers on in game number 1 against Mad Lions. It was never given to him again, banned in every game. Other things like Hecarim, I understand not wanting to give someone like Grell. He really was the focal point for Isurus, and that's not what I was expecting going into this tournament. Seiya definitely felt like the player to look for, but this team played way too fast for Seiya's playstyle to really take as much effect as it needed to. In this game, though, it was all about the jungle. He picks up the Wukong, and honestly, I'm just waiting for more teams to remember that Wukong and Trundle are really good. Obviously, Trundle banned out in this game, but Wukong is available, and Grell picks it up here, and it does exactly what Wukong does. He's a fantastic early game jungler that can cause pressure into the Maokai, really exploit a lot of weaknesses he has when it comes to slowness, if you don't know, like, the optimal clearing path, and then is phenomenal in teamfights, does scale really well as that engaged threat. The ultimate is always going to be great, and he's always going to be slippery with the W, and so the Wukong is still good. Like, I know the movement speed and the attack speed have been nerfed, but he is still a viable pick, and Grell definitely shows that off here, is able to generate a really huge lead in the early game against that Maokai pick, mostly playing through top and mid, and then is able to just transition that into the late game. You've got other scaling picks here as well, like the Kai'Sa, like the Aatrox, that are going to be very useful in the team fights overall, and so if you can get that Wukong rolling in the early game, things are just simply going to progress, and you got to give a lot of credit to Grell, because even in the tough circumstances that he's been handed, he has been able to at least perform in them, and so for me, pretty easy choice for player of the game, pretty easy choice for player of the tournament for Isurus, at the very least, and that's definitely worth something. But Seiya definitely came into this tournament with a reputation. A lot of Latin American fans will definitely tell you that he plays like Bjergsen in the sense of he plays kind of slow. He really likes to generate his own lead and then play for team fights in the late game, not take too many risks. Certainly doesn't like to take like 3v3 engages in the mid game, and that's kind of bled over into Isurus' playstyle, but I think Seiya definitely opened up a bit more during this tournament. His laning stats were actually pretty good if you look at them compared to a lot of the other people in this group, and he really beat Saren in this lane matchup. The Victor was not useful at all. The Sylas was really able to just shove and roam and be more of a proactive threat, which is definitely something considering I thought Saren was really, really good yesterday on some of these assassin picks, like the Akali, and didn't want to go back to them here, wanted to go to that more Control Mage Victor style of play because you do have a volatile bot lane here, and I think Saya was able to take advantage of that relatively easily. You do draft the Kai'Sa, the Rel. Obviously, I'm more of an Aphelios fan, but if you can play the Kai'Sa well, you have engage pieces with the Rel. That's something that you always need, in my opinion. With the Kai'Sa, you can't afford to draft that without super hard CC. I definitely think Rel fulfills that, and Gavoto and Jelly certainly had their best game of the tournament in this one, playing against Holy Phoenix and Farfetch, who just weren't a problem at all to deal with in the laning phase, out of the laning phase, anytime really. And then, like I said, ADD actually had a really good game on the Aatrox, his best game of the tournament by far. But for the Wildcats, a little bit of a different story. You were really hoping they were going to be able to pick up a win against a pretty weak Isurus team, if we're being honest. But even then, a lot of their problems just kept compounding. A lot of the things that they struggled against the better teams, they weren't able to fix in this one, and it was definitely a little frustrating. Players like Starscreen and Ferret really just weren't what they were in the TCL. Those were two very important players. I talked Starscreen up a lot going into the tournament as someone who I thought was a really good weak side top laner and someone who showed really good instincts on when to be able to push, when to play it safe, really good team fighter, and he just did not show up at this tournament at all. Ferret I thought also was incredibly important, but he was often on Maokai duty, which it's very difficult to do well on Maokai when the rest of your team is inting. You had Saren, who definitely showed moments of flash here. The Akali game yesterday was certainly interesting, and he definitely kept it fun. But in the end, he goes back to victory here, and it is not a good one. He gets completely shoved out of this lane by Saya, often taken advantage of here by Grell in the mid game. Really is able to generate that lead for Isurus basically by himself. And then in the late game, when you're Victor from behind, like, those lasers aren't doing any damage. You're basically just wave clear at that point. Unfortunately, that's just what he turned into. And then there's Holy Phoenix and Farfetch. Maybe the worst bot lane at this tournament, like, actually. They were really, really bad. Like, I did not expect them to be this bad. They pull out the Neela Yuumi here, which I get the idea of, but man, did it not work. Like, Yuumi still did a ton of damage in this game because the buffs to Yumi's damage to make up for the fact that she heals technically less here it's significant, and it makes Yuumi very much a poke mage down in the bot lane, but golly, you just can't justify this build on Holy Phoenix. I know he always talks about going Eclipse, and he goes Eclipse in the TCL, but it's just not good. Like, I don't know why you do it. And that showed in this game. He was actually the one that was funneled a lot of the resources in this, and he did literally nothing with them. He couldn't do anything with them because he was Eclipsed, so he would go in and just die. He would get CC'd and die because he has no shield bow, he has no protection, and I just hate that build, and it certainly came back to bite them. It's gonna get flamed, and it's probably rightfully so, so. Overall, not a good game from the Wildcats, not a good tournament from the Wildcats. You really hope the TCL would show up and be better than this, but again, you know, not in the same situation as OS, because with the LCO, like, Riot stopped funding them, and yes, all their players went to other regions, but, like, it's because they don't count as imports and anything like that. Turkey did generate a lot of fantastic players, obviously players that we now know in major regions. Broken Blade, Closer, even someone like a Kaori that is now on Evil Geniuses, even the players that played there for stints, like Abadage and Caps even. Like, there are a ton of people that you know in major regions that played in Turkey. It's just not that region anymore. All the good talent gets snatched up very, very quickly, and what's left is this, and this is just not good enough. Like, this team came to this tournament and was just simply not good enough. The TCL definitely fell off in quality this year, and it's frustrating to see that. Hopefully they can bounce back again for next year with the full year of development, but for Isurus, you gotta feel good for them. They're the feel-good story of this tournament, or of this day for me at the very least, because I was just really hoping they were able to get at least one win in front of the home crowd. It would be really disappointing for, yes, I know I had them as the worst ranked team, and I didn't project them to get any wins in this group, but it would have been really disappointing for them to finally have a Worlds in their own country, in their own region, and for them to not be able to get a single win. They were able to pick that up here, and I think there were a lot of good moments. And so, overall, very happy with the Isurus win, and it's got to feel good to at least put a little bit of a bow on your Worlds experience. Now we get to jump into the fifth game, and this is where things really start heating up. The final two games here are incredibly important. This one probably more so. One of the teams with number one on the line, number one in their group on the line. If they can win this, they are in groups, no problemo. The other is fighting for an opportunity to keep their number one dreams alive if they can beat them. We have the 4-0 DRX taking on the 3-1 Mad Lions. And DRX is able to pick up a scrappy, super duper scrappy win here. And Mad Lions has to feel absolutely devastated that they're not able to pull it out in the end here, because they had complete control of this game. Basically, from moment one. Gotta give a ton of credit to Elyoya, and trust me, I will give a ton of credit to Elyoya because he was the best player in this game. Well, he was the second best player in this game, and it wasn't really all that close. Like, the top two were so ridiculously phenomenal, and Elyoya did such a great job from moment one, really being able to put DRX in a very difficult position. They pull out a pretty crazy comp here that we would actually see a lot of the other teams take a little bit of inspiration from, with the Bel'Veth coming out here. You had the Vex Mordekaiser as the solo laners here. Thinks that you could be really proactive on the Mordekaiser, obviously. It can do well into the Camille. I know a lot of people think it's a counter matchup. It can do well into the Camille. The Camille can just be good. You know, theoretically, like, Arma can be good in this matchup, and he's always going to be useful late game. Mordekaiser ult is never not useful, so as for an R5 pick, I think it's fine. You give Nisqy something super proactive to be able to make plays on, and he honestly played this game really well towards the mid game. Unfortunately, it didn't matter. And then you got the Bel'Veth for Elyoya. I talked about in the pregame how I really wanted Elyoya to be on something that could take over. Pyosik has often been the exploitable part for DRX, and Elyoya has often been the focal point for the investment of Mad Lions, and I really wanted to see those trends continue here, and boy, howdy did they listen. Obviously, Bel'Veth, a pick that I'm not super into just generally, but if you want to dominate the early game and you have a plan for it, if you can get Bel'Veth rolling, like, yeah, I mean, she rolls, like, for sure, and that's exactly what happened to Elyoya. He gets a 3-camp buff to start. He's, like, 2 levels ahead of Pyosik for almost the entirety of this game, purely based off of the start that he was allowed to get in this one, and I certainly don't think he's going to be allowed to get it again, but man, was he able to take over the map. He was able to invest a ton into this mid lane, making sure Nisqy was able to generate that lead. He was able to be first to every objective, start stacking dragons very early. You can see that in the total. They got 4 dragons. DRX got none. Like, they basically waltzed to Seoul in this game, and it was easy for them. It really was the mid game that things started to kind of go wrong, and it was mostly because you just didn't have a lot of other players on this team performing. You had Elyoya, who was doing a ton of damage, but it's still Bel'Veth. You're still capable of just being CC'd and killed, and that was certainly something that Elyoya had to be at least aware of. And then Nisqy was making plays. Those ultimates could be absolutely crucial if you were timing them right. He got targeted a bunch in the early game by Pyosik, and he was able to dodge a lot of that. And in the mid game, he was doing a ton with his Fear. Obviously, the full engage from Vex is very difficult to deal with if you are a relatively short-range comp that is kind of close together. And that's just naturally what someone like Sejuani, like, breeds, because you want melees in top and mid with Sejuani to be able to compound with her. And so I actually really do like the Vex pick in this game, and it did work out. Like, Nisqy was causing a ton of headaches for DRX, mostly because he was just playing super duper well. So Mad Lions lost this, but you certainly cannot pin it on Elyoya and Nisqy because I thought they played their hearts out. But for DRX, really, it's the same story we've been preaching the entire tournament. It's the same story I've been preaching for the past, like, 3 months or whatever on this channel. Like, ever since I consistently started covering the LCK, Zika's the best freaking player on this team. He's become a top 10 player in the world. Like, it's really hard for me to doubt that at this point, because he single-handedly dragged this team from the brink of extinction back into the light. The Sylas play towards the back half of this game was quite literally perfect. Like, there is absolutely nothing I would change. He saved this game for Mad Lions by himself. If you don't believe me, I would highly recommend you go rewatch the VOD. Phenomenal. I mean, player of the game, come on, like, duh. But, like, it's just unreal. He's player of the game in this one. He's the only player in play-ins, and probably the only player in any world championship that I can remember, that has gotten every single player of the game for every single one of his team's games, and they went undefeated. Like, he has been the best player on DRX every single game, and they won every single game. Zika has been more dominant than anyone on RNG, than anyone on Mad Lions, anyone on Fnatic. You can stack him up against anybody in play-in so far. It doesn't even come close. He has been that good, and he single-handedly beat Mad Lions here. The Sylas play was extraordinary. It's really hard for me to do it justice, so I just recommend you go and watch the back half of this game, because, golly, it was fun to watch overall, and you gotta add Deft and Barrel into that as well. Deft with the Sivir Yuumi being pulled out here, obviously something that's catching on. People know that it scales, and it is going to do well into these more early game focused AD carries like the Misfortune. If they're going to be consistently blinded, this is a counter pick in my opinion, and Deft and Barrel play it well. Deft is doing 1 billion damage by the end of this game, and you know who's also doing 1 billion damage? Barrel on this Yuumi. I tweeted out a pic. Barrel did the 2nd most damage in this game. What? How is that even possible? This Yuumi champion somehow, in my opinion, is it's like she's certainly different, but I think she's a little bit better now than she was just a couple of weeks ago. Maybe the 80 carries that she typically pairs with aren't as strong, but her damage getting buffed is ludicrous for the poke in lane, and she still does so much outside of lane. We saw those Qs hitting and doing a quarter to Misfortune and Vex throughout a lot of the mid game. If you're not prepared to take on the Yuumi, she is absolutely disastrous to play into, and I think Mad Lions learned that the hard way, but it wasn't all sunshine and rainbows for DRX. This is the first time in this tournament, at least, that I'm going to be giving out dud of the game onto a player on the winning side, because it's got to go to Pyosik. I've never, ever seen someone play Sejuani in a 33-minute game and not hit a single ultimate. I haven't gone back and checked the tape. I haven't done a double take, because obviously, I got to get this video out on time, and it's already like 3 in the morning where I'm at, but like, Pyosik, just be okay. Like, I understand, it's not entirely his fault, right? It's hard for me to entirely blame him because he got completely path diffed in the early game. Elyoya 3-camped him. He made the mistake of going to check his bot side and there were no camps there, so Elyoya got his entire top side, like, as well, and that's gotta be frustrating because when you essentially get a quarter of the jungle camps on the map to start your game, like, you were at such a disadvantage, but his play in the mid game was atrocious, like, giga bad and like a substitution worthy. Obviously, Pyosik got benched in the regional finals specifically for the reason that he was the worst jungler for this team. I think we're going to see that play out at Worlds as well. Juhan is sitting there. He was phenomenal in the games he played. Pyosik was very good before this, but Pyosik just doesn't have that same level of consistency. If you're gonna get at least remotely equal levels of production from Pyosik and from Juhan, except Juhan's not gonna have one random game where he's just completely dog water, then put him in. Like, let him play, and DRX's ceiling is going to go up. Their floor is going to go up by a lot. I really think this team's going to be in a much better spot if they just go with Juhan, and I think Pyosik proved that in this game, but Kingen was fine overall. Definitely some good games, some good moments, I should say, on the Camille, but not, bad ones too. But that's it for DRX. For Mad Lions, God, I'm frustrated. Like, they had this in the palm of their hands. This was the biggest jungle diff of the tournament so far, even on, like, dominating games. Like, I don't know if anyone dominated the way Elyoya dominated Pyosik. And it absolutely did not matter. Niski played a really good game, like I said. Some phenomenal engages on the Vex. The fear timings were nearly perfect in the mid-game. The stopwatching, the, like, just the baiting out of pretty much everything. Jat said it very well in the cast. He was absorbing so much pressure, and I think he was really doing that for Mad Lions. It allowed Elyoya to get giga-fed here. But Armut, Unforgiven, Kaiser, they did nothing in this game. Kaiser's engages were really bad on the Leona. It's definitely concerning to see that because we had always been saying throughout the year with Kaiser that, oh, it's just not his meta. Like, enchanters really aren't his thing. He'll be better at Worlds if it's an engager meta. Well, it's an engager meta at Worlds, and he certainly had his ups and downs. Unforgiven certainly has had his highs, but has, been a little inconsistent in this stage as well. Armut, I actually thought it was better at the tournament so far than he was at any point throughout the LEC regular season or playoffs, but that is neither here nor there. You just gotta feel bad for Elyoya and Niski because everybody else on this team basically just got team diffed, like Deft and Barrel beat Unforgiven and Kaiser. Kingen was probably more relevant in the late game than Armut, and at that point, like, Zika was just the best player on the Rift, and so DRX was able to pick up the win. But for Mad Lions, Elyoya and Niski kind of trapped in elo hell, and it just sucks. What does this mean for their tournament? It means no first place. It means that at the very best, they're going to be in a tiebreaker with RNG in order to get that second seed, and that's only if RNG manages to lose in the game after this, which, spoiler alert, is relatively unlikely. So for Mad Lions, you're probably looking at a third place finish, which means that you've got to play 2 best-of-5s to get out of Worlds play-ins, and that's not the worst stage to be in, obviously. Gives you more time to play on the patch if you do get out, but you certainly wanted to put yourself in a better position than this, and sitting at 3-2, obviously kind of what everyone expected going into it, but just the way it happened is definitely a little demoralizing with this game kind of being in the palm of your hand. And then for DRX, boy, are they going to be happy. They hit the 5-0. They confirmed their spot in Worlds group stage. They have now officially placed first in this group at 5-0, which means that they don't have to play a single best-of-5. They are immediately slotted into Group C, and if they play a lot like they played in group stage, especially like they played against RNG, I mean, this is a team that very easily could make it out of group stage at Worlds, which would just be a phenomenal run for DRX. I just want them to be able to keep the pace up. If Zika and Deft can play like this the entire tournament, like, they should pretty easily be able to get to at least quarters, maybe even like semis if everything clicks for them. Especially if Juhan comes in and shores up the floor for this team. I just really freaking love what DRX is doing right now, and I'm just really hoping they can hang on. Moving on to our 6th and final regular game here. Obviously, the outcome of this will determine if we have any more to talk about. Well, we do, because of Group A, but it will determine how many more we have to talk about. Some wins here. A win here could lead to 0 tiebreakers. Another could lead to 2 more game tiebreakers being played here. So let's go ahead and see, as we had the 3-1 Royal Never Give Up taking on the 2-2 Saigon Buffalo, and RNG is able to pick up the win here. It was very, very interesting. A fun game, not in the same way that the last one was fun, where in the last one it really felt like Mad Lions had full control until DRX just like grabbed it back, but in this one it very much was like, this is just a fun game to watch. RNG did kind of have control of the game for most of it, but Saigon Buffalo sure wasn't going to go down without a fight, and that definitely made it interesting. Let's go ahead and talk about the team comps first and foremost, because definitely an interesting draft from Saigon, but you can start to expect that from the VCS teams. I warned people these drafts were going to be insane, and we're definitely getting them, but for RNG, it's a pretty standard LPL comp, honestly something that we've seen a bit of throughout the year, and it definitely started exploding in playoffs, where you have this really big threat in the bottom lane that's going to be able to pressure lane with the support that is going to be able to make plays with the jungler. Now, it's typically not Shen. Shen is not the one that we often see in this role, but for Ming, it makes a lot of sense. He's actually played a lot of Shen in his career, and honestly, compositionally, it does work rather well with the Tristana. Obviously, it gives you a ton of macro pressure because you don't even really have to leave lane in order for you to be a threat to join any sort of engage in team fight. If the other team overextends, that gives a lot of the other players on the team the ability to go in deeper than maybe they would have liked. I think that justifies the Vi pick just a tad bit more. Wei obviously loves the Vi. I talked about this in their preview. This is a pick that he went to extremely often in the LPL, even when it really wasn't all that applicable. Vi is good because point-and-click CC is good, and obviously she does have a ton of engage, but she really is a lot squishier, and her damage is kind of mediocre, especially towards the back half of the game. You're really not going to be getting a lot of damage out of the Vi pick, but it is justified a tad bit more when you think about the Swain, or the Shen, I should say here, because Shen can offer that gigantic shield to give Vi more flexibility in that engage, and also Vi being deep in the enemy team gives Shen a really good avenue to be able to get into fights late if he needs to, and be in a good position to affect them in a major way. It also does a lot of good for the Sylas and for the Fiora, just in case they're ever in a side lane or in a fight where they need just a tad bit more protection. Especially Sylas, if he gets that extra bit of time to be able to get some healing off with some of his abilities, that is absolutely massive for the champion. I think Shen synergizes well with that, and obviously it gives Tristana the things that she needs, which is relatively a relatively tanky partner that can go in and engage. The taunt is always going to be useful. Tristana already has her own peel for the most part with the jump, and so you really don't need a lot of peel on that side. You really just need someone that's going to be able to set Tristana up to be able to deal her damage, and I think Shen does that well. And you gotta give credit to Ming in this department. He played the game phenomenally. You really don't think of Shen as being able to be someone who can take over the game in that kind of way, but Ming is just a different breed. There is a reason why I have him as my #1 support in the world, and games like this are why, because I'm not going to say RNG would have lost this game without Ming on Shen, but it certainly wouldn't have been nearly as easy. There were so many moments that Shen was able to join, cause a lot of havoc, be able to turn fights in favor of RNG. I can think of multiple in the mid game where even if RNG did lose members in the mid part of those fights, Shen was a huge factor in being able to turn them around, being able to stick in those fights as long as needed, and he always was able to get out with just a sliver of health left, and the Tristana was able to do so much free firing on the back because of it. Obviously, Gala benefited majorly from it, but he still played great. He has been playing great in the play-in so far. His positioning has been awesome. I still have the same complaints with Gala that I had going into the tournament. This hasn't really changed much in the sense of I want to see him have that more takeover mentality in lane. I want to see him attempting to get 2v2 kills. It just doesn't seem like something that this RNG bot lane wants to do. I think that might be a little bit of a hindrance going up against like the best teams in the world, but clearly against Saigon Buffalo, that's not going to matter, even though I really do like Shogun, who we'll talk about. But the Vi pick, not a huge fan of it. I talked about that. It did end up working because the Shen shields ended up working out, and having point and click on Aphelios is always good, but there's really no other good targets. Honestly, it's pretty easy to disengage the Vi with this comp. I think Lilia can do it pretty efficiently, Lee Sin can do it very efficiently, and so can Zac, and so there's a lot of tools to actually stop Vi from being able to go in, but Sylas was there for backup, obviously Shen was there for backup. You can't stop them nearly as easily as you can stop the Vi. And then you round all that out with the Fiora in the top lane. And while the Fiora for Breathe didn't exactly like win early, like the amount of pressure that Breathe was able to generate so consistently on this Fiora pick was a huge reason why RNG was able to win this game. They started stacking dragons early, but the threat of Fiora really caused Saigon to not be able to go for a lot of these objectives, because if they committed too hard to any specific part of the map, Fiora was just simply going to get either a tower or an inhibitor towards the back half of the game, and she actually did. She got bot inhibitor all by herself while Saigon was trying to fight for objectives, and so just that pressure alone, like, that's the exact reason you take this pick in the first place. This is what's been happening in the LPL playoffs. Teams that have really felt they've been able to get a macro lead have been able to pick these side lane threats, play those 4v4 matchups, and force the other team to make a decision. Most likely, especially, no offense to VCS teams, but they often play with their hands and not their heads. A team like Saigon Buffalo, like, I definitely see why they felt like they could accurately do this, because you put the enemy team in such a difficult predicament. They have to make a split-second decision or else they lose everything, and RNG is by far a good enough team to be able to take advantage of that and to be able to push that to victory. And so, really good game from RNG. Gala and Ming were definitely kind of the focal points, but huge credit to Breathe, because without him, I certainly don't think this would have been nearly as easy. As for Saigon, comp-wise, I actually do like this comp, interestingly enough. The Lilia top, the Zac mid, obviously things that we've seen at this tournament. I didn't hate how either of them played. I honestly thought Hazmed played the laning phase really well, and the Lilia stopped Fiora from being able to generate at least a strong lead in that top lane, which was huge. If Fiora was ahead in this game, it would have been unwinnable for Saigon. Even some of these fights that they were able to take in the mid game, I just don't even think would have been possible. The Zac mid pick, I understand why you pick it, because it really does well into Sylas, but outside of that, he's really not contributing a lot. Obviously, the CC is phenomenal, and if you're able to get on top of a lot of people, you're able to do a lot of damage, but this is a big dive comp with Lee Sin, with Zac, with Leona, and really the only diveable target here is Tristana, and even then, like, she's just gonna jump out, and so really not a lot of good options for you to be able to dive onto. Zac, unfortunately, just wasn't all that useful in the mid to late game. You know who was useful in this game? Shogun. And talk about something that has come to fruition. Talk about a good take going into this tournament. I have been incredibly high on Shogun all year long. In fact, even before I reviewed the VCS, obviously I watched the VCS relatively casually, but I never watched it in depth until I needed to for the tournament. But watching playoffs, like, holy crap, Shogun's really good. Like, he is way too good to be in the VCS, and I'm someone who likes the VCS. Like, I think they are easily the 5th best region in the world, but he is, like, he could go to NA or EU right now and be a top 3 or 4 bot laner in the region. Like, he is that good. He has those kinds of mechanics, and he's a smart player. He's a very good late game carry. His positioning in late game teamfights has been phenomenal at this tournament. It's been phenomenal all year. Even on champions like Misfortune, he's really able to consistently be able to put out a lot of damage, even without the ultimate, because he just has a really good sense for when he can step up, when he can play around. I honestly think he's incredibly elo-held on Saigon Buffalo, and I still like this team, but the difference between Shogun and everybody else on this team is absolutely massive. I said this on Twitter, and I think it's a little bit controversial, but honestly, I see him as just a better version of what Doggo was last year for Beyond Gaming, where Beyond was really in a lot of these games at Worlds and MSI because Doggo was able to, push forward and do a lot for that team. Shogun is that for Buffalo, but I honestly have more faith in Shogun to be able to participate in one of the major regions and really, really show up. And so maybe something for some of the other regions. We know that NA hasn't been super keen in importing a ton of Vietnamese players, but if you're ever going to do one, I think Shogun would be that guy this year. And so really, really good performance from him, but it just wasn't enough. Bean J played awful in this game. Taki played awful in this game. They were simply just a little too heavy to carry. I don't think Taki hit an ultimate on anybody this game, or at least like dead center. Wasn't actually able to stun anybody with that ult. It was just kind of tossed around casually and never really landed. Bean J played horrible on the Lee Sin, completely anchored the rest of the team down. If you're gonna pick the Lee Sin, I always talk about this, you simply have to generate the lead, or else the pick is completely worthless. And unfortunately, they weren't able to do that at all. A lot of their lead and a lot of their comeback came in a lot of skirmishes that they had around the 15-minute mark. By that time, Lee Sin was really just a kick, and it was on Shogun and Hazmed, to an extent, who were able to generate a lot of the leads themselves, but it certainly wasn't Bean J on this Lee Sin, and that was disappointing. For me, he is clearly the dud of the game here, but again, Taki was also pretty bad on this Leona. So overall, what did I think of this game? Well, Saigon Buffalo definitely has pieces. I think they're going to be a scary best of 5. They did lose here, which means they are 4th place in the group. It locks in Group B. Group B is actually no tiebreakers. Everybody's locked in. Saigon will be the 4 seed, playing against the 3-seeded Mad Lions in a best of 5 tomorrow. That is going to be an absolute blast. I'm not going to say that Saigon's favored in that, but they certainly could take a couple of games. Shogun just might be one of the better players in the series anyways, and so That's certainly going to be fun to watch. If everybody else on Saigon can finally step up on the same day, then maybe we'll have an interesting series, but that's a big ask, I think, for this team. And then for RNG, maybe not the situation you wanted to be in going into play-ins, but after the loss to DRX, you did everything else you needed to. You secured your second place spot in this group. That means you are going to have to play a best of 5. You have no idea who you're going to play it against. It's going to be whoever ends up winning the 3-4 matchup from Group A, and that matchup is going to be decided by tiebreakers, but for RNG, they should be, I mean, they are massive favorites no matter who they play. They're the Exodia of group stage now, and they're kind of the gatekeepers. Unfortunately, if you run into RNG, your tournament is probably over in that best of 5, and so they look really, really good here. Obviously, if Gala and Ming can keep playing like this, Breathe, Wei, Xiao, everybody's looked good in this group stage so far. I just want them to be able to keep this up. Obviously, certainly still some things to iron out. I don't think they're a perfect team right now, and I've said that on the channel, but, I mean, they're about as perfect as a play-in team is ever going to be, am I right? All right, well, that's going to do it for the 6 regular games that happened here. But, of course, as you know, even though Group B did not end in any tiebreakers, Group A did. There's a 3-way tie currently for second place, with 3 teams sitting at 3 and 2. I talked about this earlier, but the tiebreaker rules are game time in your victories against whichever team that you beat, unless, obviously, one team went 2-0, etc., etc. But every team went 1-1 against all the other tied teams, and so it's game time in those victories. That means Loud's game is the shortest because they were able to beat DFM faster than any of the other wins. EUG comes in second there. Their win over Loud was about 30-ish minutes, whereas Loud's win was like 24 minutes. It was really fast. And then DFM's win over EG earlier today was like 36, so they come in third. That means Evil Geniuses and DFM are playing in our first tiebreaker game here, as you can see on the screen, and the winner will be playing Loud for a chance at that number 2 seed, and the loser here will be the number 4 seed. Obviously, all of them already confirmed for best of 5s, but it's all about placement at this point. You don't have a shot at getting the number 2 seed if you can't win this game, and luckily, for North American fans at the very least, Evil Geniuses very much came to play in this tiebreaker as they were able to take the game in about 28 minutes, and this was dominant. This was a great performance from an Evil Geniuses team that had already lost to DFM today for them to bounce back and look so good in this game, and obviously put themselves in a pretty strong position moving into the next one. Has to feel very, very good. Obviously, a couple of interesting picks here. The EG side is very standard, and honestly, this is my kind of draft. Like, this is the draft that I have endorsed throughout the entirety of plans. I want to see more Akali. I want to see more Aphelios. And if we're playing Aphelios, hell, give me Thresh. Vulcan looked phenomenal on Thresh when he pulled it out earlier in the tournament. He gets it again here in a very pivotal game. Obviously, losing here is detrimental because it means even if you win your best of 5, you gotta go play against RNG, and that's pretty disastrous. So a win here was important. They put Vulcan on the Thresh. He is obviously phenomenal on the Thresh, and he has another stellar game. He got player of the game earlier in the tournament for the Thresh game. He's gonna get it again here for Evil Geniuses. I mean, what a game. What a game from Vulcan. Those Thresh Lanterns were entirely on point. It allowed all the other players in this game to play significantly more aggressively. Whether that was Kaori, who was like actually phenomenal in this game on the Aphelios, dishing out a ridiculous amount of damage. They were clearly trying to pump into him early, and it very much worked out. Or the standout member of the game in terms of the highlight plays, Jojo Pune, who, congratulations on turning 18, you are now a superstar on the world stage. This was a, defining game for Jojo Pune on the Akali. He was styling on every single person on the enemy team. Sometimes it worked out, sometimes it didn't. He would often die for the cause, but man, were those plays special. I recommend you look up some highlight reel of the game just to see the plays that Jojo was able to make. They were special. He was assassinating people left and right and really making sure that the numbers advantage was always in favor of Evil Geniuses, even if he went down fighting. But even sometimes when he didn't go down, a lot of that was due to Vulcan being there with those super important lanterns that he was able to get Jojo out of action and out of circumstances until he just went back in. Kaori definitely appreciated those lanterns, and Inspired appreciated those lanterns as well. A phenomenal early game from Inspired that really set into motion a lot of the action that they were going to make throughout this game. He was just out jungling Steel from moment 1, and on the Trundle, I really like that. Hecarim's honestly a pretty good matchup into the Trundle. comparatively, there are a ton of junglers right now that hate facing the Trundle, things like the Maokai, things like the Sejuani, that have been super high prio at Worlds, but he goes for the Hecarim, something that I do think can take advantage of the fact that Trundle isn't necessarily, like, dominant. However, the pillar is super annoying to deal with. That's why I think Trundle, in my opinion, should just be the number one jungler in the meta right now. He may not be the number one jungler power-wise, but he essentially just beats every single other jungler in the meta right now, so I don't really see why he's not being prioritized. Inspire definitely shows that here, as he has a really phenomenal game, really able to take over the map in terms of macro. Not a lot of flashy plays from him, but without him, JoJo's not nearly in the same spot, and it's more difficult for Kaori to get fed in that bot lane on the Aphelios. Very, very, very important game for Inspire. They really needed him. And then Impact did his thing in the top lane. He got the Aatrox and he was good on it. Really, he wasn't the focal point of the map. Certainly some good moments from him, but this was the JoJo show in terms of flash plays, and it was the Vulcan and Kaori show in terms of, like, raw damage output. Obviously, Vulcan not the damage, but he definitely allowed Kaori to be the damage. Just a lot of really, really good plays. Overall, really unfortunate moment for Yutapon that I called out on my Twitter while this game happened, where this big fight happened around the mid lane, and Kaori was essentially lanterned out and he had to run away. Yutapon ends up getting on the backside of that fight and is able to chase down Kaori, but it's right next to the mid wave. Yutapon Qs, and if he gets like one or two of any of those bullets to hit Kaori, he probably kills him with the next auto, but every single one of them hits the minion wave, and Kaori just auto ults and kills him, and I'm like, God, that has to feel so bad for the Kai'Sa player. I'm not going to say it's the only reason to pick Aphelios over Kai'Sa, but just generally, man, like, if you're going to play him into each other, Aphelios always wins the lane, and he does just as well, if not significantly better in the late game than Kai'Sa does. Just pick Aphelios. Everybody just pick Aphelios. Come on, man. Vulcan, like I said, player of the game, he was awesome. JoJo, the Flash player, Inspired, and Kaori were also really good. For DFM, this has got to feel bad. You definitely were in a position to be able to, like, at least play for second place, but EG's a tough competition to try to beat twice in the same day. Unfortunately, they're just outmatched in this. Like, they just weren't on the same level. And that sucks for a DFM team that obviously maybe had high expectations going into this year's Worlds because of where they performed last year, being able to get first place in their play-in group over an NA team in Cloud9 last year that, yes, that NA team did end up getting out of groups, but obviously NA play-in buffs is too strong. That's kind of what I'm hoping for EG, but DFM is not the same team. I talked about that going into the tournament. They're just simply not the same team this year. Arya being gone is a huge loss. I don't think Harp has been all that efficient in the bottom lane, even with Evie, Seal, and Yutapon still here. I do think that they definitely have problems. Like, it's not a perfect transition, and we definitely saw that in this game. Evie is so crucial to their success, as we've seen. Obviously, Yaharong and Yutapon have been kind of the top damage dealers, but when Evie has a good game, they tend to win. When Evie has a bad game, they tend to lose. He has an average game here, and Steel has a really bad game here on the Hecarim. Like I said, Steel just got completely out-jungled. He was often trying to make plays in positions where he had absolutely no right to. JoJo, in multiple scenarios, just outplays him. Like, there's really no other way to put it, and is able to kill him and pick him off and create a lot of numbers advantages for Evil Geniuses. Yaharong's Vex is not quite enough to be able to save him in situations like that, but he was far from the only player on DFM to not have a good game. Yutapon and Harp were completely outplayed by Kaori and Vulcan in this game. You pick up the Kai'Sa set, obviously a long-time bot lane that many people will know as a combo, especially for Kai'Sa, and it just doesn't work into the Aphelios Thresh. Like, you're never actively going to be able to get on either of them, because if you get on the Thresh, the Aphelios is just going to be free-firing on you the entire time, and he's going to out-damage Kai'Sa, especially in the early game. But if you get on the Aphelios, you can just lantern him out if you're Thresh, and so there's really not a lot of opportunities for Kai'Sa to actually be able to punish that. And especially when you're not the better bot lane, which they're just not, it was very, very difficult for them to actively do anything in this game. A lot of the proactivity in this game for DFM rested on Yaharong's shoulders, which is kind of how it's been for a lot of the tournament. I know Yutapon's also been very good, don't get me wrong, and Evie has certainly had his games, but I think Yaharong has been the most consistent member of DFM, and on the Vex, obviously, we've seen this pick be able to be super proactive in the mid game, and he was definitely making plays, being able to clean up a lot of the other plays that Steel ends up starting, mostly just by dying, being able to clean up some kills on JoJo and Kaori, and really being able to make plays, but at the end of the day, it's very difficult for a Vex to be able to single-handedly carry a game against an Aphelios Akali, and unfortunately, that's just what ended up happening. For DFM, that means the end of their best of ones here. It means they officially get the 4 seed. They will be playing the loser of Loud and EG in a best of 5 to determine who goes and faces RNG on the other side of the bracket in a best of 5 to get out of groups. Obviously, not the position you want to be in, but as a minor region team, it's really difficult to ask for more. Honestly, DFM is really hoping Evil Geniuses wins this. They don't want to have to face EG a third time, well, a third, a fourth, and a fifth time later on, because I think the more games you play against North America, the more that's just going to show to be a pretty big gap between the two. They would much rather, I think, play Loud. So they're really hoping for a North America victory here, and I can definitely say Evil Geniuses is in that boat as well. They're going to have to play another game in just a moment here against Loud. They really need to win this. I've talked about this. This is probably the most important game that they will play at the tournament overall this year, almost with no question. Maybe the other, like, whatever ends up happening if they do win, but like, you cannot be in a situation where you're the 3 seed, and even if you win your best of 5, you have to play RNG, because at that point, you can basically kiss your dreams of getting into World's group stage goodbye. It's just simply not going to happen. This is a must-win for Evil Geniuses, and you really gotta hope they're able to do it. If this game is any indicator, they're playing really, really well, and it's good to come off of a fiery win with some momentum, but they have to be able to keep that up against a Loud team that has been very fiery over the course of this tournament so far. All right, well, that is going to bring us to our 8th and final game of day number 3, the final tiebreaker that will determine the number 2 seed from Group A, the one that will bypass the first best of 5 and play the winner of 3 and 4 from Group B, a very crucial slot, because you definitely want to dodge RNG. And the winner of Loud versus Evil Geniuses was Evil Geniuses in 27 minutes. A dominant victory from an EG team that, boy howdy am I glad they showed up here today. Obviously, the loss against DFM to start out the day was disastrous. We could have been in a position to potentially play a tiebreaker for first place. Us not being able to get the job done in that circumstance was heartbreaking and awful, but we're able to get it done in the long run. We're able to take down DFM in the rematch. We're able to seal the deal against a very, very scary Loud team. And we're able to push ourselves onto that number 2 seed and dodge RNG, at least for the play-ins here. And it's off the back of a really dominant game. Even in draft, I actually wasn't a huge fan of either of these teams' drafts. I really don't like the Viego, generally, for Loud. And Sejuani top, I think, is doable, but there's just better picks. There are picks that do that job, but better right now. In my opinion, you're the one that banned out the Ornn. I know that you wanted the flex for Sejuani, but I would just rather have that in the jungle and then go for a more aggressive top laner, something, even if you want to go for a tank in the top lane. Gnar is up, and I do think that is more aggressive while still being playable, and so, I don't know, I don't like the Sedge top pick. I think it's significantly too passive. It invites counter pick, which happened, and then the Viego pick is just not something I think is all that good in the meta right now. Obviously, you want to pair that with Taliyah because you need to get that Viego fed. You need to make sure he gets online, and Taliyah is going to help do that. I do think Taliyah is good in the meta right now. I think she's underplayed overall, but you have Misfortune Nautilus, not the best Misfortune lane. You kind of leave the Amumu up past the second round of bans in order to get banned out. I don't agree with that. I think that would have been a must pick for me instead of potentially the Misfortune. I think Amumu is more viable in that case because you can get other things where the Misfortune, I think, needs that like heavy CC to be relevant, especially in laning phase. And then on EG's side, I didn't love this draft generally. I would have preferred the Aphelios over the Kai'Sa. They were hovering it, and I think I would have preferred that, but obviously Kai'Sa gets the job done. And Mordekaiser into Sejuani, I think, is fine. It certainly works as a counter matchup, but you do have to get ahead early in order to snowball that, because Sedge does scale really well. If that lane goes relatively even, then you're going to be fine. If both junglers just completely ignore it, then you're going to be fine. But you know what? Both junglers did not ignore top lane. Certainly was an interesting start to the game. I'll kind of talk about the beginning phase a little bit here, because it was a little bit of a chess match between Inspired and Croc. They kind of split the map in half. Inspired got the top half, and Croc got the bottom half, and then Croc goes to recall, and then goes for a lane gank top lane, while Inspired is very slow to be finishing up on Wolves and Gromp in the invade. If Croc does enter that jungle, there's a really good chance that he catches out Inspired, and potentially can snag a pretty easy kill there on the Trundle, which would be awesome for being able to compound this Viego into the late game. That's pretty much exactly what Loud needed to do. Unfortunately, he assumes that Inspired would have caught on to the invade a lot sooner, and so he just assumes that Inspired has already taken his camps, which unfortunately he hasn't yet, and so he goes for a lane gank in the top lane. Inspired then goes up and kind of plays towards the top side. I believe he was taking his Krugs, but plays towards the top side, and there ends up being a skirmish here as Croc essentially walks into Inspired, where Inspired's able to get a ton of damage off at the start of the fight, able to pillar. Robo comes in to try and save his jungler, but he ends up falling and giving first blood over to the Mordekaiser, which is about as disastrous of a start as Loud could have asked for. If Mordekaiser, like I said, gets rolling in this lane, Sejuani has absolutely no chance of doing anything. They both scale relatively well, but that's from even. Sejuani from behind is just like punching into a brick wall against Mordekaiser. And then, Croc is like, okay, well, we need to get this Sejuani back on track. So he goes again for more top lane pressure. He goes for the 2v1 gank while Sejuani is low on a low Mordekaiser. And Mord's able to pick off Robo, and then he gets the shield, and he's able to pick off Croc as well in the double kill. And now Impact is like 20 CS up, 3 kills up, and the game's over. Like, Impact just wins the game from here on out. The Sejuani and the Viego are both completely useless. And the Viego is your win con on the side of Loud, and he spent his entire early game trying to play towards a top side losing matchup. And I don't understand it. It was really awful decision making from Loud overall, and definitely something that needed to be much better. I mean, this bot lane was certainly something that you could have invested in. The Misfortune really does deal well with the Kai'Sa early, so long as you're in a position to do so, and a lot of jungle pressure on the side of Loud could very much have been the deal that needed to break that open, but it didn't happen, and Impact is able to snowball this game entirely out of control. A lot of credit has to go to Impact for being able to play this out. Obviously, the double kill was phenomenal, but he was able to do a lot with that lead. They were really never able to contest a lot of objectives so long as the Mordekaiser was there, because not only the threat of the Mord doing damage, but the threat of Mord ulting any of the carries away, especially Croc, at any objectives, made it completely untouchable for them to contest a lot of these objectives. Even when Impact got in trouble, he's such a good Mord player that he knows, I'm in the middle of a Misfortunal. If I just ult the Nautilus right now, I go to the Death Realm with the Nautilus, and he's not going to live while I'm there, and I no longer get hit with the Misfortunal, and I can save a ton of health, so when I come out, I can clean up the rest of the fight. Like, that is such a heads-up play, and Impact is a smart enough player. Like, he really was just able to take over the game. A super easy choice for player of the game on the side of Evil Geniuses. Impact has really been struggling, I think, for the majority of this tournament, especially in laning phase, but this was easily his best game as he absolutely obliterated. But a lot of credit also to Kaori here. A phenomenal game on the Kai'Sa. I really was disrespecting the Kai'Sa pick. I really wanted the Aphelios, but he proved me wrong. He really went in, was able to do a ton in these late game team fights. Obviously, Impact was drawing a ton of attention, but that really just allowed Kaori to do a ton of damage on the Kai'Sa. And if you leave this Kai'Sa to free fire, she is going to hurt a lot, especially because she was able to generate a lead. Impact was able to get his lead in the top side, so Inspired and JoJo really spent a lot of time investing into that bot side. I remember they dropped Rift Herald down there, really trying to accelerate the Kai'Sa. If you had both sides of the map being huge problems, they knew that that game would essentially be over at that point, and they were entirely right. Vulcan did a lot to help out Kaori. Those ultimates were great from the Leona. JoJo was doing a ton of damage in the back half on the Azir. And like I said, Inspired just kind of started it all with that fantastic pathing topside. I'm not even sure it was entirely his fault. It was more so Croc making a bad play, in my opinion, than Inspired making a good play. But he was in the right place at the right time, and that sometimes is what you need to do in League of Legends in order to win games. And so, great game overall from EG. They're going to be so happy to win this. For Loud, it's heartbreaking. You had one game to clinch the 2 seed in this group, which would have been absolutely phenomenal, but you still have the 3 seed. Season's not over. You just need to see some improvements. Now, I was talking about Loud as if a lot of their success at the tournament was like unprecedented, and I do agree with that. Like, they played much better than their tape would have suggested, and a lot of that was Robo and Croc in the top lane. Those, unfortunately, were the 2 players that kind of let you down in this tiebreaker game. Robo's gonna get my dud of the game on the Sejuani. Really was not able to do anything at all into Impact at any point in this game, but this very well could have gone to Croc as well. Some awful, awful decision-making from Croc. Investing in that top side pretty much all of the early game basically ended the game for Loud. Like, if he was just bot lane instead, especially because he got the entire bot side of the map in terms of jungle camps, like, it just simply would have been a much more difficult game for Evil Geniuses to win. But he tries to go for the more risky and, like, unseen play. Like, he wants to try and surprise Inspired, who probably expected him to just go for bot lane, and tries to go for a top gank. It ends up not paying off, and it ends up getting Impact so far ahead that the game is over. So Robo, Croc, both of them not very good. They both have to be better if this team wants to do anything. And then Branson Seos, like, I know you didn't get any jungle pressure, but neither did Kaori and Vulcan, and you still lost the lane as Misfortune and Nautilus. And I'm not going to blame them because they didn't play, like, awful games or anything, but they really needed to win that lane a lot harder than they did in order for Loud to have a shot. Tinones was fine in the mid lane, it was whatever, but Robo and Croc really threw things away for Loud in general. Now we're set up in a situation where it's going to be Loud versus DFM in that 3 versus 4 spot in a best of 5. The winner is going to be playing RNG. It feels like both of those teams are relatively doomed, but we'll get to that in my preview at the end of the episode. What does Loud need to do in order to put themselves in a better spot? Well, Robo and Croc have been instrumental in this team's, like, emergence at Worlds, with Branson Seos kind of being the main focal points. If those 4 can kind of get back to being on the page that they've been in throughout most of the group stage, like, this team is probably going to be fine and they should be able to beat DFM, which we'll talk about later. But for Evil Geniuses, it really is a sweet spot to be in. You're at number 2. That's kind of where you thought you would be going into the group, but you had a chance at number 1, so it's got to feel at least a little less sweet. But at the end of the day, if you play well, you're going to set yourself up for at least a decent shot to be able to get to main Worlds group stage. Now, it's not an easy path by any stretch. You've got to play the winner of Mad and Saigon Buffalo. Both of those teams, I think, are scary, but this team absolutely has the talent. If JoJo plays like this, if Impact can get leads like this, Inspired was awesome throughout the group stage. If Kaori and Vulcan can be a little bit more synergized as a bot lane by the time we get to that point, Evil Geniuses is not an easy team to beat by any stretch of the imagination, and I think they're going to make the most of getting this number 2 seed. All right, well, that is going to do it for my Worlds Play-In Day 3 overview and analysis. It's the longest video of Worlds so far by a considerable margin because all of the games today definitely felt like they were fun, but most importantly, they had an impact. There was a lot to talk about. Up on the screen right now, you're actually going to see a little bit of an opinion slide here. This is my all-pro group stage team for play-ins. Now, I will say there are definitely some controversial picks here, but mostly these are the 5 that I wanted to talk about in their roles the most. Not necessarily the 5 players who were like definitively the best, but certainly I think the 5 players that stood out to me the most in terms of how they played. We'll go from top to support, just kind of talking about how I felt about them. I've got Robo in the top lane for Loud. Talk about a coming out party. This was someone who I really wasn't all that impressed with in my CB LOL playoff review, but he's been awesome at Worlds so far, tiebreaker notwithstanding, and he's been a big reason that Loud has been able to upset. They went 3-2 in groups. They were able to beat Fnatic. Like, he is probably the biggest reason why they were in that position, because without him, I don't think they have that same kind of pressure. He was consistently able to beat Impact and Wonder in their games, obviously, not the second time around, but the first time around, which was absolutely huge for them. Honestly, Robo was just phenomenal, and he was really fun to watch. I have Inspired in the jungle spot here. A lot of contenders for jungle. I think Wei was in this conversation for me as well, but I kind of wanted to keep it to 1 per team, and you'll see I have an RNG member already here, but Inspired was phenomenal here. I mean, there's really not a lot that EG cannot attribute to Inspired. A lot of their game wins were because Inspired was able to generate a lot of early leads, especially early in the group stage. His early games were incredibly important. He was able to carry a lot of those games from that position. Even in a lot of the games today, the tiebreakers included, while he may have not been the focal point, we talked about both of the Trundle games and the tiebreaker scenarios where he was phenomenal, and he set everything up to be winnable for Evil Geniuses. So he was a pretty good choice for jungle here. No brainer in the mid lane. It's Zika. I'm not going to go into explanation. He was the best player in play-ins, and it wasn't even remotely close. If you don't have him here, it's your fault. Like, you're losing your mind. For AD carry, I have Shogun. I've been singing his praises the entirety of this series so far, this Worlds review session, and I completely stick by that. I do think he is a top-tier player that could be in a major region, and I really do hope we get to see that. I think he's a little bit elo held on Saigon Buffalo, and that might become a problem when we get to maybe some of the farther stages of this tournament, maybe the best of 5 here, but for now, I just think he's awesome. He might actually be the best player in that best of 5, and Mad Lions have the LEC MVP. And then support, it was Ming. This was pretty much a no question for me. He's been phenomenal. He has these crazy picks like the Set, like the Shen, that he can pull out and just be phenomenal on, but it's not like he doesn't play the Nautilus and the Leona just better than anybody else in the world, and so I'm really not all that concerned about Ming. He definitely showed up at this tournament and continued to prove to a lot of people why he is the best support in the world, but that's going to bring us to my quick overview and explanation of the 2 series that we're going to be getting tomorrow, the 2 best of 5s. The first one from Group A being Loud versus DFM, the 3 versus 4. And if I had to make my prediction, I'm going to have Loud going over in 4 games. I think it could potentially be 5, and honestly, DFM could very realistically win this series. I think this is a very, very close series to call, but Loud has just shown significantly more for me at this tournament in particular. I think going into this tournament, I would have told you that DFM was the better team, but I really like how Loud has played. Again, I think a lot of this hangs on Robo and Croc on that top side of the map. If those 2 can outplay Evie and Steel, then Loud should be able to win. If Evie and Steel are able to outplay Robo and Croc, I think DFM are going to win, because I do think that Loud has a better bot lane, but I think DFM has a better mid lane, and so I think it's really going to be up to that top side to really determine how the series goes for me, at least what I've seen at the tournament so far. I'm going to put my faith in the CBLOL in Brazil, and I'm going to go with Loud in 4 games. And then in Group B, we've got the 3-seeded Mad Lions taking on the 4-seeded Saigon Buffalo. This is another really interesting series, but especially with what we saw when these 2 teams played against each other, I'm gonna pick Mad Lions to win this series in 4 games. Do I think this could go 5? Absolutely. Do I think that Saigon could win it? that is maybe stretching a tad bit too far. I do think Saigon is an incredibly scary team to go into, and if you're telling me that Shogun can just straight up win 1 or 2 games by himself against Mad Lions, I certainly don't disagree with you, but as a whole, Mad Lions is just so much better across the board, and Elyoya showed a different part of his game today. If you could just funnel him in, Niski played great. If you get that jungle mid duo that you've been getting out of Mad Lions all year, especially into a matchup like Bean J and Froggy, which I think is very exploitable for Mad Lions, I definitely think they should be walking out of that series with a win and moving on to face Evil Geniuses. And obviously, we'll talk about those series once we get there, but my official predictions are Loud, but very well could be DFM, and then Mad Lions a lot more confidently than I have the Group A matchup. So that's gonna do it. I really do hope you guys enjoyed. It's been a lot of fun to put these videos together for the plans. It's certainly not over. We're gonna be starting the best of 5 coverage tomorrow, so I hope you guys are excited. If you did enjoy this video, it really would mean a lot to me if you left a like on it. Obviously, if you've hit the end, I really hope that you enjoyed it. It's been an hour and a half, basically, of League of Legends content, and so I really do hope you leave a like, and if you do enjoy the content I make here, I would really appreciate if you hit the subscribe button, because I'm going to be putting out content like this all throughout the World Championships, not only for the rest of play-ins, for the group stage, for the knockout stage, everything. We're going to be talking about all of the teams, and if you enjoyed this, I promise you're going to be enjoying everything else that I put out over the course of Worlds. But with all that being said, I hope you're having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day, and I will see you all later.